Thank you so much for coming. We're delighted you could join us for our June Wild Coachella lecture. I'm Kelly Irwin, Special Events Manager at UCR Palm Desert Center. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luceno, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. We also want to give a big thank you to UCR Palm Desert Center partners for your generous and steadfast support, allowing us to bring you event after event, year after year, even in a pandemic, providing opportunities for learning and discovery for everyone. Please use the chat feature to say hello and let us know where you are tuning in from. To help us keep organized, please put your questions in the Q&A. Colin Barrows will be facilitating our Q&A after Dr. Byer's presentation. You can submit them at any time during the presentation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Cameron Barrows, research ecologist at UCR Center for Conservation Biology. Take it away, Dr. Barrows.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Paul Byer as our speaker this evening. Paul is the Emeritus Regents Professor for the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, which is in Flagstaff, Arizona, one of my other favorite places in the world. And he has created a career of studying animals that live and work within habitat corridors and the connectivity between habitats. One of the real measures of success in academia as a scientist is how many people cite your research. And I was able to find that Paul has over 13,000 citations of other researchers who have cited his work, which is phenomenal. It's really quite amazing. I met Paul for the first time probably close to 25 years ago. He was, and perhaps continues to study, a population of mountain lions in the Santa Ana Mountains in Riverside and Orange County. And at the time I was working for the Nature Conservancy, and we were trying to do a conservation plan for the Santa Ana Mountains. And Paul and I sat up on a ridge and looked down a bunch along a landscape of ranchettes, and I looked at it and said, "Oh, is that going to block mountain lions travel?" And he said, "Oh no, mountain lions just move right through that stuff. That's not a problem," which really opened my eyes to how just adaptable mountain lions can be if we give them a chance. So without further ado, we're going to turn this over to Dr. Byer, and he's going to regale us with his stories about mountain lions.
Yeah, so I'll be talking tonight about my work on wildlife corridors. As Cam mentioned, I've been at it for a long time, a little over 30 years now. I'm now with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, which is based in Bozeman, Montana. So I'll start this by talking about my work in Southern California. In 1988, I got my first job, a 5-year study of mountain lions in the Santa Ana Mountains of Southern California. As you can see, it's a peninsula of habitat that juts into an urban area. There's Greater Los Angeles, Greater Riverside, Greater San Diego coming up on this side. Whoa. Is the city of Fallbrook in here, city of Temecula. Some rural residential areas here, but you can see it's jutting out into this urban area. It's about 600 square miles, which is and sounds like a big area, but for mountain lions, it's not very big. It has about 15 breeding animals in that population. So it's that's pretty small and could be subject to demographic and genetic instability. And in fact, it is. That's one of the first things I found out. You'll notice here too that, and we'll return to some of this later, the other mountain ranges in the area are similarly becoming enveloped by urbanization. The Santa Monica Mountains, probably most at risk. There's the Simi Hills, the Santa Susanas, the San Gabriels, the San Bernardinos, the San Jacintos, and the Palomars. So during the first year of my study, I had radio tagged 7 adult females. I started off just in the southern half of the mountain range, but here I had these 7 radio tagged adult females. None of them had cubs, and none of them had cubs at heel. And that was very surprising because their gestation period, just like your house cat, is about 90 days. And the cubs stay with them for about a year. So the fact that there's no cubs with the mom and she's not giving birth for a year was quite terrifying. At the end of that first year, though, I heard vocalizations of an adult male, saw his tracks, heard him copulating with each of those females. He was a busy young man. And in year 2, 6 litters were born. 6 of those 7 females had cubs. Most of those cubs died during the 3rd year of the study, and that's quite normal for most vertebrates, actually, is that most animals don't live very long. Only about half of them at most survive to their first birthday. But I had enough information from those first 3 years to build a demographic model to try to ascertain or predict or understand how badly at risk this population might be. Basically, the population model says this population's doomed if it's isolated. But if we can maintain connectivity to other populations, and by connectivity, I mean just enough possibility for 2 or 3 or 4 animals per decade to migrate into the population, it could survive indefinitely. So I had this news. Okay, it's not looking too good, but if we can maintain connectivity, we'll be just fine. So that brought up the question that dominated the last 3 years of this study. And I phrased the question here in a particular way, and we'll talk about why I chose some of these words. But the question I was trying to work on for those last 2.5, 3 years were, will dispersing pumas, I should say pumas, mountain lions, cougars, panthers, they're all the same thing. It has many common names. So will these dispersing puma use degraded corridors in this urban Southern California landscape? So I guess there's 2 adjectives that need explanation here. One is dispersing. So I really want to focus on this life phase of an animal called dispersal. It's when an animal leaves the area where it was born and was raised and closely associated with its parent, and then moves somewhere else where it attempts to join a breeding population. For some animals, like for birds, actually, the females are the predominant dispersers. They move far away. The males often settle close to mom. For mammals, it's the opposite. The males generally move far away. 80% of them go way far away, maybe 20% stay close by. Females, the opposite. 80% of them settle close to mom, 20% of them disperse, meaning they attempt to go someplace else to become part of the breeding population. So this, if I knew my adult animals were not using corridors, they're stay-at-homes. So if I want to know about use of these corridors, I got to study these animals during that dispersal phase, which starts around 10 months, and generally they disperse by the age of 14 to 16 months. And then I'm interested in whether they'll use degraded corridors, and that's simply because degraded corridors are all we have left in this landscape. None of these were designed as corridors, designed for conservation purposes. But I wanted to know, well, here's what we got. If they'll use something bad, they'd probably do even better in a corridor that we design on purpose. So here in my landscape, I had 3 corridors that I was interested in. During the second year I expanded, I was radio tagging animals throughout the mountain range. But of the 3 corridors, this is the most important. This is the one that Cam and I sat on a hill and looked at 25 years ago, the Santa Ana Palomar connection. And again, this is the suburbs of San Diego, city of Fallbrook here, the village of Rainbow right about here, city of Temecula here. Interstate 15 runs through this area, but this is the only possibility for animals to immigrate into the Santa Ana mountain range. So it's one of special interest. Coal Canyon Corridor is also of interest. It's the only connection. Coal Canyon is a little small canyon flowing northward out of the Santa Anas, joining the Santa Ana River here. and provides a possibility for a connection to the northward extension of the Santa Anas called the Chino Hills, about 60 square miles. So again, this is way too small to support a mountain lion population. So this corridor is important, as is the Santa Ana Palomar. The third corridor, Arroyo Trabuco, is not important demographically in that an animal could go from, say, this part of the mountain range to this part just by staying within the intact habitat. But it's about 7 kilometers long, a pretty narrow, long corridor, and adults didn't use it. And I want to know, will these youngsters find it and use it? Well, my sample size was 9 radio tagged juveniles, and I was fortunate that most of the juveniles I radio tagged and who dispersed were males. Again, they're the better dispersers, so that's going to provide me some potentially good information. And we followed them closely. This was in the old days. There was no radio satellite telemetry. This was walking around with a handheld directional antenna and listening to little beeps and driving around in your pickup truck and triangulating. So we'd stay up most of the night. That's when these animals are most active, following the animals, go to sleep and follow them the next night, trying to determine their behavior with respect to these 3 corridors. So what did we find? Well, a good thing is when you have small sample size, only 9 dispersers and 3 corridors, is it was a pretty strong, you want pretty much unanimity. So all 3 of those corridors were found and used by dispersers. As you can see, that Coal Canyon corridor, 3 of the dispersers encountered it, 2 of them successfully passed through it. The Santa Ana Palomar connection, 1 of the 2 dispersers who encountered it successfully moved through it. And the Arroyo Trabuco, that long, thin corridor, all 3 of the dispersers who encountered it successfully moved through it. So we'll go through, I'll just give you an illustration of what each of these looked like. So here's the Coal Canyon corridor. It's the shortest of the 3, but it is very barrier rich. Here's the mouth of Coal Canyon in the bottom photo. This is the Riverside Freeway. That median is no longer there. It's now 12 lanes wide, but at the time, it looks like it was maybe 4 lanes in each direction. There's a vehicle undercrossing here, and right here at the tip of my arrow, there's a culvert, a long dark box culvert that pops out on this side. This is the lower part of Coal Canyon here. So an animal, once it made it across the freeway, would enter this equestrian stables. So that's why it looks paved, because the horses basically turn vegetation into pavement. If it made it through the equestrian stables, it would cross the Santa Ana River, which is a perennial river, would cross through a golf course and across a railroad track and up some steep cliffs, and then it's home free in Chino Hills State Park. So it's short, but very barrier rich. And again, 2 of the 3 animals that encountered it successfully used it. Here's an animal who did not. This is a picture of M10. The photograph was taken right about at this location where he failed to get across the freeway. He's sitting in the median strip in this photo. I had actually followed him the night he was born and raised on Camp Pendleton, way at the south end of the mountain range. Moved his way along the mountain range, exploring peninsulas of habitat, finding it went nowhere. I was actually following him the night he came into Coal Canyon, and he walked north. About 2 in the morning, he came to the mouth of Coal Canyon, could see the stream of traffic. He could see it was dark beyond, but he wanted to wait for daylight. So he parked himself in a clump of oak trees right over here and waited for daylight. I went to sleep, and I woke up to a call from California Highway Patrol saying, hey, we have a radio tagged mountain lion in the median of the freeway. And here he is. By the time I got there, he had hobbled back. So he didn't succeed in crossing, but he was not killed. He broke his hip. He lived a few more months, basically eating skunks. Here's the animal who was the most successful user of the Coal Canyon corridor. He used it to cross that freeway 22 times in the last 18 months of the study. He would spend a few weeks in the Chino Hills, come back through the corridor, spend a few weeks here in the Santa Anas, and move back and forth. So again, as ugly as that looks, this animal mastered it and used it successfully to maintain this sort of dumbbell-shaped home range. Here's the Santa Ana Palomar linkage, again, the most important one. It has fewer impediments, but like everything in Southern California, it has a freeway crossing it, Interstate 15. Here I'm looking up the Santa Margarita River upstream, downstream is at the bottom. This is city of Temecula at the time was, and this is all being bulldozed and is all now homes. It's a big urban area. So it has a freeway and a golf course again, but then then you're in pretty good habitat by the time you get out here. The Nature Conservers have been doing a fabulous job of buying up all the private land abutting the freeway in this area. We'll get there. This one was one of the two animals who encountered it, successfully used it. He actually walked up the Santa Margarita River, came right up to the bridge, and it's a big, tall bridge, but it was noisy, and the lights of the city of Temecula ahead, so he actually backed up from the freeway, went south along the edge of the freeway, crossed at grade, and successfully moved into the Palomar range. This is the area where he crossed. This is Interstate 15. Here's the northbound lanes, and here's the area where he crossed, right at the crest of where the Interstate 15 goes through that saddle between the Santa Anas and the Palomars. It's an area where 3 untagged pumas were also killed in vehicle collisions. So we know animals would like to cross here. Here's the third one, Arroyo Trabuco, about 7 kilometers long. It was by far the best habitat, though. It has a mature forest of sycamores and oaks in the bottom, has a small perennial flow. It's only crossed by one road, which is about 200 feet above the canyon. It's protected by these 200-foot bluffs on either side of the canyon. Here's the city of Mission Viejo on one side, the city of Rancho Santa Margarita on the other side. Animals were very comfortable there. They spent several days, in contrast to the other corridors that they moved through within the matter of a few hours. Again, so it describes why this was a good place for a good corridor. So this got me very excited. So I thought, wow, we know these corridors are important. We know that they'll use some pretty lousy corridors. Well, imagine what we could do if we designed corridors on purpose, not only for pumas, but for other animals as well. And that's what I've been doing ever since then. So the big question then became, how can we conserve corridors to create a network of wild lands? At first, I did a lot of work opposing developments like this. This is your typical Southern California development. I guess I don't have to tell you folks, many of you are from this area. Somebody buys a couple thousand acres of land, bulldozes everything and replaces it with residential and commercial areas. So I started off fighting these sort of proposals that would compromise connectivity. And I was actually a plaintiff in 2 different lawsuits, one against the Foothill Transportation Corridor, which has not yet been built, and one against a housing development, which has also not been built. I didn't win either lawsuit, but it was a delaying tactic. And again, this has to be done, but it's never going to get you where you want to go. You never get to where you want to go by fighting against what you don't want. That only, that might be a necessary step, but eventually it took me about 7 years to figure out that if we want to conserve a corridor, we don't just fight things we don't want to see, we work towards what we do want to see. So we did this here in 1999, we wrote a plan for conserving the Coal Canyon corridor. The plan was a joint project among Chino Hill State Park, U.S. Forest Service, and Caltrans, importantly. We had, and a lot of other groups. So there were 3 parcels that needed to be bought, one which is most of Coal Canyon, 2 smaller ones, those equestrian stable properties in the bottom. Here's the last parcel being bought. This is Gary Hund, who's still working on conservation in Southern California. He was at the time with Cal State Parks. And as part of that, we had to address, of course, both aspects. We couldn't just buy the property and have a 12-lane barrier in the way, nor could we just build a freeway crossing structure and have all that property turned into urban areas. So we had to coordinate and do both things at once. And so here is a picture of the first interchange in not only in California, but I believe the first interchange in the United States to be relinquished and turned into a wildlife crossing underpass. This here is the asphalt breaking ceremony 2 years later. All of this takes long, and that's one message that will become clear as I talk. None of this happens fast. It happens slowly. So 2002 asphalt breaking ceremony brings up the one quiz question today. What do you call the first freeway interchange in the United States ripped up to create a wildlife underpass? And for those of you who didn't speak up in time, we call it a good start. We got to do this several hundred more times in the United States and more places throughout the world. So then how do we conserve other important corridors in the region? Again, here's one. What about this big connection to the Palomar Range? What about the Santa Monica's to the Simi Hills, to the Santa Susanas, to the San Gabriel's? We got a lot of work to do. So this is very much a collaborative effort. So I worked with a group called SC Wildlands, which is still very active. I just participated in, Cam was part of this workshop about 3 weeks ago, working on conserving some of the linkages here in Southern California. So each of these linkages had a lead agency and partners. And we at SC Wildlands, South Coast Wildlands, did mostly the grunt work of modeling corridors. So for one thing that I learned as a scientist is that we lead by serving. None of us, I did not spend the millions of dollars to buy that land for the Coal Canyon corridor, nor the $3 million it took to convert that vehicle underpass into a wildlife crossing structure. So really our job is we are working for the people who are really getting the work done. So I'll go through some of the sort of steps we take in designing these corridor plans and implementing them. One of the first steps in designing a corridor is to select focal species. For most of the linkages designs I've worked on, and I've worked on 30 or 40 or 50 by now, we start off identifying all the species that are going to need connectivity between the core areas that are going to be connected. So here are some potential focal species. This, for those of you in Southern California, I don't know if this creature is still there at that dinosaur theme park on Interstate 10. He's looking south across Interstate 10. He hasn't crossed yet. He might not even be there anymore. But we do consider a variety of focal species, including things that are reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, things that need connectivity. We have several types of focal species that we look for. Here are 3 of the types. One would be things like mountain lions, the things that are area sensitive species, we call them. They live at such low population density that they'll be the first to disappear if corridors are lost. So these are always among the focal species we have. Another group would be habitat specialists. One thing about those area sensitive species is that a lot of them are habitat generalists. They can move through some pretty degraded stuff. So if I got a corridor for mountain lions, I probably wouldn't have one that would work for a tree squirrel that needs continuity, say, of oak trees. We also have barrier sensitive species. In Arizona, where I live now, probably pronghorn is the most sensitive to highways and fences, and very sensitive to fenced highways. You could have hundreds of pronghorn radio tagged for 10 years and they will not cross a fenced highway. So if I can build a highway crossing structure that works for pronghorn, it'll probably work for almost anything. So we look for these types of species and we recruit local people to suggest who they are. I'm an outsider coming in. I don't know who all these species are. One other thing that we often look at, and I remind people when we're suggesting focal species, is to think not only of passage species, species that in a few hours or a few days could pass from one end of the corridor to the other, but some of these corridors might be 10 kilometers long. And for something, we got to consider the corridor dwellers. Things here in southern Arizona, sometimes we use Gila monster as a focal species. They're a species that is never going to make that 10-kilometer or 15-kilometer trip between core areas, but it might move into an area. It needs to find mates, have food, its offspring move a little further, and then maybe its grandchildren make it to the other core area. But we try to consider these species in our linkage designs as well. Here's an example between the southern Sierra Nevada at the top and the coastal ranges, southern coastal ranges here in the bottom. This is the Tehachapi Mountains in between. So we had 9 focal species, 3 broad strands to serve those species. Our motto being no species left behind. We also then try to write comprehensive plans. So again, the 2 main elements I've mentioned already. So all of them, every one of these has a highway crossing it, or a railroad, or a canal, or all of them. So how are we going to get creatures across those linear barriers? And then we have to, of course, conserve land. So no good to have a crossing structure if the animal can't get to it. So we deal not only with land conservation, but also highway crossing structures or canal crossing structures. We have guidelines for lighting and fencing and invasive species. How are these going to be managed? What are the tools we might use in terms of zoning or outright purchase or easements and then all of them also have people living in them, and the plan never includes a requirement to make people move away, but rather to try to engage the people who live there as people who are proud to have this linkage in their backyard, and they're engaging as stewards. Field assessment is walking through some very spotty areas and trying to figure out how are we going to get animals through this area. Here's this concrete lined creek. Is that permeable for amphibians that might be in the creek bottom? What about this housing development with this slope facing my connective area? What about this little dude ranch? How is an animal going to perceive this and its ability to move? Here's the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail. And this is an old photo. It has nothing to do with our recent idiot in the White House. We have for many years have had a 20-foot steel fence here at the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail. Here again is the Interstate 15 and that Santa Ana Palomar connection. This is an area where you can tell that this is an artificial slope on either side. When they built the freeway, they blasted down into bedrock about 30 feet to build this freeway through it. So we're not going to have an animal come down this manufactured 30-foot slope and then an underpass under this road. So what we're proposing, and I think we might only be about 5 years away from getting, is a vegetated overpass for animals in this location. Again, we've acquired the land. The Nature Conservancy has acquired the land on both sides. The exciting part for a conservation biologist is that it's not just mitigation. I call mitigation as a synonym for slowing down the rate at which things get worse. When you get to propose and implement something like a vegetated overcrossing structure, you actually have an opportunity to make things better than they are today. So that's been one of the very exciting parts of this sort of work. So corridors are now widely accepted. Here, the governors of the 13 Western states, 11 of whom were Republicans, in 2008 unanimously adopted a commitment to conserve wildlife corridors, both within their state and to adjacent states. Here in the state of Arizona, here's a wildlife overpass on US 93, which was turned from a 2-lane road into a 4-lane road back in 2011. Here is right after this was constructed. You can see there's no vegetation growing on it right here. Right now it's starting to get vegetated, but here, just 2 weeks ago, it looked exactly like this. The concrete technically isn't even dry at 2 weeks. And this is a photograph of a bighorn sheep crossing this crossing structure. They knew where to put it because Game and Fish had radio tagged bighorn sheep on both sides of the highway, followed those radio tagged animals. Not one of them ever crossed the 2-lane road, not once in 7 or 8 years of data collection. But this was the part of the freeway where animals approached the freeway on either side. So they said, we're building a crossing structure here, and they did, and it worked immediately. Here's another linkage I worked on north of the city of Tucson, a linkage between the Tortolita Mountains on the west, the Santa Catalina Mountains. Those are the big mountains you see on the northeast side of Tucson when you're in Tucson. Here's the linkage design that is slated for protection. Here's an artist's rendition of a freeway overpass. This has actually been built. Again, everything takes long. We wrote this plan 2008. It was approved for a crossing structure in 2011. It was built in 2018. It takes approximately forever, but this is actually built now. Another kilometer up the road, there's a underpass, wildlife underpass. And the day this picture was taken, this was also taken. This is a desert tortoise, one of the focal species, in this under construction wildlife underpass. It's a lot of work on corridors. I've done some consulting work for the government of Bhutan, which is committed to connecting all 9 of its protected areas, which are very large protected areas. And once this is fully implemented, this will be the first nation in the world. Actually, somebody told me there's another one. First, perhaps second nation in the world to protect more than half of its land for conservation purposes. So this is the last slide, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So some lessons. I call it thinking like a mountain. I wrote a little essay, learning to think at landscape level. So here's some lessons that came to me over these last 35 years. First one is we have to work for what we want to see, not against things that we don't want to see. We have to be collaborative. One of my mottos here is that none of us is as smart as all of us. As scientists, we lead by serving, not by telling people what to do. Has to be comprehensive in terms of species. Again, the motto is no species left behind. Has to be comprehensive in terms of the issues that the plan addresses. Have to deal with roads and land conservation and a lot of management practices and the tools we're going to use to get where we want to be. And then an exciting part is that we can go beyond mitigation. We can strive to make the landscape more permeable than it is today. So I end with this particular photo because it's a confluence of a lot of types of movement. This is the confluence of 2 freeways and 2 smaller state highways in Southern California. There's also a railroad running through here. There's high voltage power lines, which have also microwave dishes on them. So we're moving electrons through here and digital information. When I took this photo, I was actually standing on the California aqueduct, which brings water 450 miles from the Sacramento Delta down into the San Fernando Valley. So we have all of these things moving through this area, cars and electrons and people and water. And that ridge in the background is the last ridge between the Santa Susana Mountains and the San Gabriel Mountains. So we also have an opportunity to have one more green layer of connection through this landscape. I'm very optimistic that it will happen someday.
The PCT uses a corridor underneath I-10 near Whitewater. Do animals use it as well? If not, how do they cross the freeway in this area?
I'd be faking it if I said I knew. I've seen that under crossing. I assume animals do use it. I know that's still threatened by adjacent developments and some of the sand mining and other solar wind farms that are down in the Whitewater River Valley down in the bottom. So I think that crossing structure might be the least of our problems in that area.
Yeah, I believe they've done some folks maybe associated with UCR have done some studies there, and maybe somebody could speak up and be
Right.
more authoritative.
So I had a student who did her master's degree looking at that very corridor, and she never found a mountain lion going through, but had bobcats and coyotes and just about everything smaller than those go through there on a regular basis. So it functions for most things pretty well. Whether or not the mountain lions saw that it was a reasonable place to cross or not, I'm not sure.
Cool.
Yeah, it definitely brings up, I mean, to me, that was one of the first places I thought of when I saw your slide of the bighorn sheep crossing the wildlife overpass, because that's an area, there's bighorn sheep on either side, and there's at least maybe apocryphal stories or anecdotal stories about bighorn sheep that used to cross that area. And of course, at some point they must have crossed, right? But it hasn't happened in a long time, as far as anybody knows.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
maybe
bighorn sheep are also reluctant to use underpasses. They're not as reluctant as a pronghorn, which, is not going to use an underpass. But for both pronghorn and bighorn sheep, you're much better off with an overcrossing structure. I mean,
right,
100 times better off. Yeah.
You can imagine, right, that it's not anything like the kind of habitat they would prefer to use, right?
Yeah, they don't use caves.
Yeah. So we have a question from Brad about, do you know about the corridor proposed for the 101 freeway near Calabasas?
My geography is, my memory is so bad, I don't know if I do or not. I know we did some work on that where 101 crossed, but I'll just have to say I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. We had there was a question in the chat from Joan Taylor, and she's asking, how do scientists determine the minimum width of a corridor for different animals? And she gives the example of a tortoise as a potential example.
Yeah. So there's no research on that. I'm doing some research now that hopefully will lend some empirical evidence to justify width and shape of corridors. I published a paper just a couple of years ago where I recommended a minimum width of a kilometer. And basically my recommendation is still not based on evidence because we don't have it, but it's what I call my no regret standard. That if I said, oh, 500 meters will be fine, and I got the 500 meters, and then I lived long enough to find out it didn't work, I'd say, well, we just wasted a lot of money, huh? But so if I want to recommend something that I'm pretty sure will be a little bit wider than we absolutely have to have. So for a short corridor, 1 kilometer. For a long corridor, I say 2 kilometers. And that's just my no regret standard. And I do think I hope my project that I'm working on now will give us an answer, because it could save us many hundreds of millions of dollars. These things are expensive. Mm-hmm. But it's an excellent question. I wish I had a real answer.
So that's referring to like the distance between one protected area and the next?
No. That's the width of the corridor.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of these are several kilometers.
The overpasses are less than a kilometer, right?
Oh, that's right. Except for pinch points. Yeah. So there'll always be pinch points. Yeah. But yeah. So the corridor to me is the whole thing connecting the two protected areas. But sometimes, of course, you just have a road going through a protected area. And then, of course, you just have the crossing structures. And so the pinch points are always, we're never going to have a 1 kilometer wide.
Right.
And unless we elevate the road or put in the tunnel.
Right.
So we have to expect that animals are going to negotiate these pinch points. And we know they do. They've done a lot of work monitoring these crossing structures. And we know that it takes about 2 or 3 years for them to become used. So the first ones were built on the Trans-Canada Highway in southern Alberta, and some here in Arizona, actually, that were built about 10, 15 years ago. they put up cameras, and the first year it looks like nothing's using it. And people
Mhm.
think, oh man, we just wasted all that money. Nothing's happening. Or 2 animals use it. The second year, a few animals use it. The third year, everybody's using it. So it takes some social learning, probably scent trails getting laid down, and of course, fencing the rest of the road so that they are funneled towards those crossing structures.
Mhm. That's great. Let's see. We have a question. If you want to support in terms of potentially donations or volunteering or anything like that, is there like a hub of places, or what's your recommendation there?
Wow. I'd say mostly, well, that's a tough one. You know, if you got big bucks, give to the Nature Conservancy, you know, because they are
Mhm.
really they're active in many of these efforts. But probably for most of us, you know, who don't have big bucks, I'd say try and get involved in a local effort near you. And then you know, your money can help, but also your political support can help engender the interest and commitment on the part of decision makers and transportation agencies, county land use planners, you know, to move this thing forward. So I'd say look locally. And yeah, you might wonder how to find them, but you contact your local conservation organization. They know what's under threat and what they're working on. And it's
Yeah,
great
I think
opportunity.
not necessarily a corridor, but as we speak, there's a Palm Springs City Council meeting going on where they're discussing protecting some habitat with a group called the Oswald Land Trust. So there's definitely groups locally doing that kind of stuff
Right.
in the Coachella Valley area. Someone's asking about P22 in Griffith Park. What do you think about that, or if you have any
Oh, I mean, it's wonderful.
inside information, maybe?
Yeah, no, I know Seth Riley and Jeff Sikich real well, the folks who run that mountain lion study. I'm great fans of theirs. You know, I think it's just beautiful that he made such publicity of the importance that animals actually live and use this area. You know, he's the one who was photographed with the Hollywood sign behind him.
Mhm.
Yes, yes, yeah. Everybody's seen that picture. So I think it just generates interest in this. That population is enormously at risk. You know, I said there are like 12 to 15 breeding animals in the Santa Anas. There are 4 or 5 max in the Santa Monica Mountains. So it's gone if it loses its linkage. They are probably on the verge of building a highway crossing structure. It's been designed, it's got legislative support, it's got money. Of course, everything takes forever. I've been saying this for 3 years now. But
Yeah.
they're going to build it. But that'll just get them to the Simi Hills. And then you got to get from the Simi Hills
Right.
to Susanna's. But yeah.
Yeah, it's great to, I mean, I'll say, you know, I've been hearing about the overpasses, the effort to build these overpasses, especially the ones up in Canada, for a long time. And it's great to see that it does take a long time, right? But it does seem like some of these plans are finally coming to fruition in Southern California, which is great to see.
Yeah.
Let's see, we have a question about once the animals cross, how long do they usually stay before moving on? So I think you had a slide of one of the mountain lions who was moving back and forth really regularly. Is that kind of the pattern?
I'd say that's probably not a pattern. He was, you know, a youngster, and he was probably waiting for the male on the south side of the freeway to die or something. You know, so he'd come back and explore and get his butt kicked and go back to the Chino Hills where he's the only boy. And so that's probably why he was moving back and forth like that. So typically, no, they would move to a new area, establish a territory, become a breeder, and become like the adults in my study. You know, they're stay-at-homes, and they got their home, they raise their kids, and send them away. So a lot of these are really they're doing their job if they allow that one-way movement once in an animal's life.
Right, you said at the beginning that you only really need a couple of animals to use the overpass, like every 10 years or something like that.
Right. Yeah. A few animals a year. Well, and that's a demographic model too. And that's probably would also suffice for genetic to relieve inbreeding. It doesn't take much gene flow to help, but that was a totally demographic model. So I guess I should caution that they might need a little more for genetic diversity. The
Mhm.
Santa Anas now are probably the most inbred population. They have now surpassed the Florida panther as the most inbred mountain lion population on the planet. So they need connectivity.
So is there any effort to, let's say, in the meantime, while we're waiting for the overpasses to be approved and all the permits and all these kinds of things, the money to come together, is there any thought about moving animals?
Yeah, I don't think that's been proposed for the Santa Anas. I think the folks in the Santa Monicas probably have thought about it. They've studied that genetic situation. Oh, okay, so they're more inbred, but so I think it's more of an issue there. They actually monitor the genetics of that population quite closely.
I mean, for an animal like a mountain lion that like maybe really depends on its sort of knowledge, personal knowledge of its habitat, would that be successful? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a couple things about introductions for genetic diversity. One is it's risky. How do you know it's going to succeed? The other thing, part of me says don't do it because it gives people an excuse to say, let's not conserve the habitat. Oh, we'll just pick them up and move them. And then I'll say, but now are you going to monitor all the other species that might be suffering genetic inbreeding? You're going to monitor all their genetic status? You're always going to intervene in time? No, you're not. So if we want to conserve everything, let's build a corridor that works for everything. So when people talk about it, I generally drag my feet and say, well, let's work on habitat conservation. So that they can work it out themselves, as opposed to us monitoring and deciding it's time for some new genes here.
Well said. Let's see. There's a question from David about whether the traditional peoples like the Kuya or the Tongva and the Serrano are involved in the consultation process and the planning process for these efforts.
They are indeed. We have native populations here in Arizona too. We probably have more native land as a percentage of our state than any other state in the nation. So they're different. It's not like calling up an agency and they come to a meeting. So engaging with tribes is an ongoing effort. They have different government structure, but it's well worth spending that time. They generally have very strong interest in conservation and they want to do things right. They are engaged. I think in all cases, the agencies need to do a better job of engaging them in the way that they are used to being engaged, which is hard for us because our culture is, you write somebody a memo and you convene a meeting and you come out. Well, it doesn't work that way with the tribes. So you engage in the most productive way, and it's well worth the effort.
Right. And I'd imagine that probably before we built all these freeways, we would have been well served by having the process start then and say, like, where should we put the freeways?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Because they would have had a good idea of where that wildlife corridors were. Let's see. Is there, Kevin asked a question about if there's any problem with increased predation occurring at corridors. So I guess maybe like do the mountain lions or the coyotes learn that this is the place where all the pronghorn are crossing?
Good question. That's been studied twice, once on the Trans-Canada Highway and another study in Australia. And the answer is no. I remember the one on the Trans-Canada Highway. They actually monitored where kills occurred with respect to those freeway crossing structures, and there was no tendency for kills to occur near those structures. They also monitored with cameras, when predators crossed and when prey crossed to see if like predator crossings would follow within a few hours of a prey crossing using the crossing structure. And in fact, they ironically, and I'm sure it was just statistical noise, but they've actually found more often the predator would cross and that would be followed by the prey, which makes no sense at all. I'm sure it was just a coincidence, but really, no evidence that they do that. And the authors said, well, it's not surprising. These animals have a life, they have a territory to patrol. It's probably not a good strategy for them to sit in one spot and just eat at the fast food joint. You know, they just don't do that. Good question, though.
Let's see. There's a question about, have you seen evidence of species adapting well to population concentration, such as housing, roads, and traffic, without seeking safer habitat?
Huh. So some animals that just live well in urbanized
Right. I mean,
areas.
imagine sort of like coyotes or ravens or these kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Of course, those do. You know, I haven't studied those creatures. You know, mountain lions are tolerant of ranchette, you know, big ranchette developments, but they don't live. You know, they don't come into my town here, even though I'm only 2 miles, a mile and a half from where they live. They just don't come into town.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, but some do, and those we don't need to worry so much about. You know, they'll do just fine. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sort of surprised to hear that the mountain lions are so tolerant of being near people. I mean, you think of them as being, I've, you know, spent a lot of time outdoors in Southern California. I've never seen a mountain lion, seen sign, but they always seem like they're very nervous, you know, stay away from people, it seems like.
Right. Well,
but I guess they can get comfortable being around people.
Yeah. I mean, there's a limit to that, and I always tell people, they've seen you, you know.
Yeah, right.
Seen them. But you know, when I was studying them in Southern California, you know, sometimes you'd see them. They'd be parked 50 meters off of a heavily used trail. Nobody ever saw them, but they saw you.
Yeah, definitely.
And so they just kind of know your habits, and they know that along this trail, people just don't walk off of the trail because there's some, you know, maybe there's poison ivy there, poison oak. So you don't go off the trail, and they know they can sit there. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Chloe, who's a MS student supervised by Seth Riley, who's maybe somebody you know, studying mammal recovery and recolonization in the Woolsey Fire area in the Santa Monica Mountains. And her question is about if there's any risk in fragmented areas that corridors could increase the spread of wildfires.
Well, I guess I'd have to admit I don't know, but I doubt it.
Or maybe just speak a little bit about sort of how wildfires and corridors might interact, or whether the relationship is there.
Yeah, I don't really, you know, I think it'd be pretty easy to stop a fire in a corridor because it's only 1 kilometer wide. You know, you build a fire line, it's stopped. You know, fires generally spread in more intact areas, you know, so they'll spread all the way through the Santa Monicas. But once they've had that vegetated over crossing structure, I think the risk that the fire is going to go across the crossing structure into the Simi Hills is really quite small, because it's a very defensible space from the perspective of fire management. People have asked too about things like spread of exotic species or diseases through corridors, and there's really been no evidence. It's theoretically possible, you know, so we can't say it'll never happen, but there's been no evidence for spread of disease or exotic species. Most exotic species, in particular plants, of course, work just fine spreading along roadsides through people's backyards and disturbed areas. They don't need an intact natural area to get to move. But I wouldn't be surprised if someday we do find a disease transmission via a corridor.
Yeah.
No evidence of that yet.
Yeah. So I think most of the rest of the questions are either answered on some level, or we have some very involved question I think might be tough to answer. So maybe if people have questions that they want to follow up with you, what's the best way to do that, or to learn more about corridor?
Well, here
studies?
let me see. I meant to do this earlier. So I will paste into the chat box all panelists and attendees a bunch of links to publications that did I hit send? Did it arrive yet? Maybe I hit enter and it'll go. Okay,
oh,
cool.
There we go.
Yeah, okay. So there's a bunch of information you can gather, papers you can read. It's, of course, a very biased view, my view, but that's available there. All of those papers have my email address on them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm always, well, I'm very busy, but I'm
Yeah.
always happy to talk about corridors.
I can appreciate, you know, wanting to answer all the emails, but not always having time, right?
Right.
Well, I think that will wrap up our presentation tonight. So thank you again, Dr. Beyer, for sharing your knowledge and research with us. That was fantastic, fascinating. And thank you, folks, for staying with us tonight. And our next Wild Coachella lecture coming up in July. We're still working on the date, but it'll be with Chris Tracy, Dr. Chris Tracy at the James Reserve, UCR James Reserve right here in Palm Desert, talking about his research into chuckwallas. So that'll be everybody's favorite desert, with apologies to mountain lions, everybody's favorite desert animal.
I love chuckwallas.
Of course, everybody does. So look forward to the announcement for when that date gets finalized, folks. And other than that, have a good night and enjoy the trails. And hopefully you'll get to see a mountain lion safely in the distance.
All right. Thanks, everybody.